You spent 12 years in a classroom, possibly 16, maybe more. You learned the quadratic formula, the causes of World War I, the periodic table of elements. You learned how to raise your hand before speaking and how to sit still for 50 minutes at a time. Not 1 hour of that education was spent teaching you how time actually works. Not one lesson on why certain hours produce more than others. Not one unit on why intelligent people consistently overestimate what they can do in a week and never once consider what they could build in 5 years. Not one class on why the way your brain perceives time changes depending on what you're doing with it, and how that single fact explains most of the gap between where you are and where you thought you'd be by now. This wasn't an accident. An education system designed to produce reliable workers needs people who respond to schedules, not people who design them. It needs people who fill time, not people who interrogate it. A person who genuinely understands how time operates is harder to manage, harder to keep distracted, and significantly harder to convince that trading 40 hours a week for a fixed salary is a reasonable arrangement. So they taught you everything except the one thing that governs everything else. The result is visible everywhere. Intelligent, capable people working harder than previous generations with less to show for it. Not because they lack discipline, but because nobody handed them the operating manual for the one resource that doesn't replenish. You can recover money. You can rebuild relationships. You cannot get back a Tuesday in 2019. It's already spent, and no one ever told you what it was worth before you spent it. What follows isn't productivity advice. It's closer to a correction. The information that should have been in the curriculum and wasn't. Pay attention to which part of this you already knew but never acted on. That gap is more revealing than anything else. Here's the mechanism nobody names directly. You don't have a time management problem, you have a time perception problem. And those two things require completely different solutions. Time management assumes you already understand the value of what you're managing. It gives you calendars, prioritization systems, and color-coded blocks. It treats time like a spreadsheet problem. Organize the cells correctly, and the output improves. That framework has generated a productivity industry worth over $43 billion annually. It has also produced no measurable improvement in how effectively the average person uses their hours. The research is unambiguous on this. In 2013, psychologist Hal Hershfield at UCLA published findings from a series of studies examining how people relate to their future selves. Using neural imaging, he discovered something precise and uncomfortable. When most people think about their future self, the brain activity is identical to thinking about a stranger, not a close friend, not a family member, a stranger. This is the hidden mechanism. You are not procrastinating because you're lazy. You are procrastinating because the person who will deal with the consequences of your decisions today is, neurologically speaking, someone you don't know. You are making decisions that affect a stranger. And humans are not wired to sacrifice present comfort for strangers. Every time a management system is ever built sits on top of this unresolved problem and wonders why it doesn't hold. The calendar doesn't fix it. The 5 a.m. routine doesn't fix it. The Pomodoro timer doesn't fix it. Because none of them address the actual variable, the psychological distance between who you are today and who you are in 5 years. This is also why people who experience a serious illness, a significant loss, or a near miss with mortality suddenly become extraordinarily productive. The psychological distance collapses, the future self stops feeling like a stranger. The result isn't motivation, it's clarity. Brutal, immediate clarity about what the hours are actually worth. You don't need a crisis to access that clarity, but you do need to understand what's been running in the background. In 1926, Henry Ford did something that confused every competitor he had. He cut his workers' hours from 6 days to 5, 48 hours to 40. The industrial logic of the era was straightforward. More hours equals more output. Ford's peers assumed he was either being sentimental or making a serious financial error. Neither was true. Ford had been running internal productivity studies for years. What those studies kept showing contradicted everything the era believed about labor. Output didn't scale linearly with hours. After a certain threshold at which his data placed consistently around 40 hours per week, Additional hours produced work that had to be redone. Errors increased. Decision quality dropped. The extra hours weren't adding to production. They were contaminating it. He wasn't being generous. He was being precise. What Ford identified in a factory in Detroit in 1926 was the same thing cognitive scientists would spend the rest of the 20th century documenting in laboratories. The human brain doesn't have an unlimited productive capacity that discipline can override. It has a biological ceiling. And past that ceiling, you're not working. You're generating expensive mistakes while feeling busy. Here's what makes this historically significant. Ford's competitors eventually copied his 5-day workweek, not because they believed him, but because they couldn't compete with his output. The person who understood the actual mechanism beat the people who were working harder by a measurable, documented margin. This is the pattern that repeats across every domain. The investor who understands compounding beats the one who trades more frequently. The writer who protects 3 hours of deep work beats the one who's available 16 hours a day. The executive who eliminates decisions beats the one who optimizes them. In every case, the advantage didn't come from more. It came from a more accurate understanding of the underlying mechanism. Ford didn't manage time better than his competitors. He understood something about time that they didn't. That single asymmetry was worth more than all their additional hours combined. The person who understands the system beats the person who works the system every time. Here is the mechanism Ford found that most people never formalize. Time is not a flat resource, it has texture. A Monday morning hour at 9 a.m. after 7 hours of sleep is not the same resource as a Thursday afternoon hour at 4 p.m. after 3 consecutive days of back-to-back meetings. Treating them as equivalent, which every standard calendar does, is the foundational error underneath most productivity failures. Neuroscientist Andrew Huberman's research on ultradian rhythms documents this precisely. Your brain operates in roughly 90-minute cycles of high neurological availability, followed by a mandatory recovery window. During the peak of that cycle, your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for complex reasoning, pattern recognition, and non-linear thinking, operates at full capacity. During the trough, it doesn't, not partially. It is functionally offline for tasks requiring depth. This isn't a metaphor. It's measurable in cortisol levels, in reaction time, and in error rates on cognitive tasks. The implication is exact. You have approximately 2 to 3 of these peak windows per day. That's somewhere between 3 and 5 hours of genuine high-output cognitive capacity in any given day. The remaining hours are available for execution, communication, and logistics, but not for the work that actually compounds. Most people spend their peak windows in meetings, in their inbox, or making low-stakes decisions that could be made by anyone. Then they spend their low-capacity hours trying to do the work that requires the peak, and wonder why it feels so difficult. This is not a discipline problem. It is a scheduling problem built on a perception problem. The practical inversion is simple, but non-negotiable. Your most cognitively demanding work goes in your first peak window, before the day has made any withdrawals on your prefrontal cortex. Everything that can be systematized, delegated, or deferred goes everywhere else. Peter Drucker arrived at the same conclusion through pure observation decades before neuroscience existed to explain it. He studied effective executives across industries for 40 years and found one consistent behavior. They knew which hours produced their best thinking, and they protected those hours with a rigidity that looked antisocial to everyone around them. His conclusion wasn't motivational, it was almost mechanical. Brilliant people who can't manage their time are useless to themselves and everyone around them. Not harsh, accurate. Here's the question worth sitting with. Do you actually know which 2 hours of your day produce the majority of your real output? Or are you treating all 16 waking hours as equivalent? Most people have never answered that question with data. They have opinions about it, opinions built on habit, not observation. The gap between those two things is where most of the lost time lives. Here is what this looks like on a Monday morning, not in theory, in behavior. The average person wakes up and, within 11 minutes, that's the documented average from a 2023 University of California study, checks their phone. not for the information they sought, for whatever arrived while they were unconscious. Email, notifications, messages, someone else's agenda delivered directly into the first and highest quality cognitive window of the day. By the time they sit down to work, the prefrontal cortex has already been running on reactive mode for 90 minutes. The peak window isn't gone entirely, but it's been partially spent on inputs that required no original thought and produced no compounding output. The best hours of the day have been traded for the illusion of being informed. This is not a character failure, it is an unexamined habit operating in the absence of a competing structure. Now contrast that with a specific, documented behavior pattern. Charles Darwin worked in 2 focused blocks daily, from 8 to 9:30 a.m. and again from 10:30 to noon. Outside those windows he walked, corresponded, and rested. He was routinely described by contemporaries as someone who didn't seem to work very hard. He produced the most consequential scientific framework of the 19th century. Carl Newport's research on knowledge workers found the same compression. The professionals who produced the highest quality output, measured not by hours, logged but by impact generated, averaged less than 4 hours of what he classified as deep work per day. The rest of their time was spent on shallow tasks, recovery, and deliberate disengagement. The distinction in behavior is concrete. The person operating without this framework starts the day reactively, works in fragmented intervals, applies high-effort thinking to low-leverage tasks, and ends the day with the sensation of having been busy without being able to identify what specifically moved forward. That sensation is accurate. It reflects what actually happened. The person operating with this framework makes one decision the night before. What does the first 90 minutes of tomorrow produce? They protect that window from all incoming interruptions. They do not check messages before that block is complete. They treat that window the way a surgeon treats an operating room. No interruptions, no exceptions, because the cost of interruption is not the time lost, but the cognitive state destroyed. The output difference between these 2 approaches, compounded across a year, is not marginal. Researchers at the University of London found that constant task switching, the cognitive pattern produced by checking messages and notifications throughout the day, reduced effective IQ by up to 10 points during the affected periods. Not permanently, but consistently across every session it occurred. You are not less intelligent than the people outperforming you. You are likely operating your intelligence in a noisier environment and calling the result a personal limitation. It isn't. It's a structural problem with a structural solution. Return to the opening observation, 12 years in a classroom, possibly more. And not 1 hour spent on how time actually functions, how your brain processes it, how it degrades across the day, how the sequence of your decisions determines the quality of your output far more than the quantity of your hours. That omission wasn't careless. An education designed to produce people who follow schedules doesn't benefit from producing people who understand them. The curriculum taught you to fill time. It never taught you to interrogate it. What you've just covered isn't a productivity framework. It's closer to a correction in the underlying model. The model most people operate on, inherited by default, never examined, assumes that effort and output scale together. Work more, produce more, push harder, go further. That model is not only inaccurate, it is precisely backwards for any work that requires depth, pattern recognition, or original thought, which is increasingly the only work that compounds. The accurate model looks like this. You have a finite and non-renewable supply of high-quality cognitive capacity each day. That capacity is highest in the first hours after sleep, degrades with reactive input, and cannot be recovered within the same day through willpower or caffeine. The work that builds leverage, the thinking, the creating, the deciding, belongs in that window. Everything else belongs everywhere else. Hirschfield's neuroscience showed you why you keep sacrificing future outcomes for present comfort. The future version of you registers as a stranger. Ford's production data showed you that more hours past a threshold doesn't produce more output, it produces more errors. Drucker's 40 years of observation showed you that the executives who understood their own peak capacity outperformed those who simply worked longer. Huberman's research on ultradian rhythms gave you the biological mechanism underneath all of it. None of this is motivational. All of it is structural. The question isn't whether you're capable of better output, you almost certainly are. The question is whether you're willing to treat your highest hours with the same seriousness that a surgeon treats an operating room. Not because it's inspiring, but because the alternative is operating on a patient with a distracted mind and calling the result a personal limitation. Most people spend their whole lives working harder inside a broken model. The rare ones fix the model first. You now know what was missing from the curriculum. What you do with that information in the next 72 hours will tell you more about your trajectory than anything you've read, watched, or planned in the last year. One change, first thing tomorrow. Protect the first 90 minutes before anything arrives in your direction. That's where it starts.